Follow along as I paint this antique piece of furniture. Gotcha! There's no way that I am painting this. If we haven't met yet, I am Jade. I'm a solo mum living in Australia and I'm flipping furniture to fund my dream home. I have never come across an antique buffet like this, so I wanted to do my best to restore it and bring it back to its former glory. My first step was to give everything a thorough clean down using Crud Cutter. Recently, I have discovered soda blasting for furniture, and if you are unfamiliar, it's actually using bicarb soda as opposed to using traditional sand in a sand blaster to remove existing finish. Normally on a piece like this with so much detail, I would go in with a chemical-based stripper, but I do find it to be messy. You've got to scrub it in and then you've got your dry time after you've actually taken the product off. So whilst this can look like it's a little bit messy, it is fast and it leaves absolutely no damage to the timber. It actually felt like it had been sanded down with 220 grit sandpaper. I was absolutely blown away. The only drawback with this cheap and cheerful gun that I picked up at Sydney Tools was that the reservoir on top was quite small. So if you had a lot of detail in a piece, I would opt to get something with a bigger reservoir. And that's just because I was refilling the tank every couple of minutes, which got a little bit tedious. But if you only had a couple of little details on a piece that you wanted to sandblast, then this would absolutely be a great option for you. Once all of my detailed sections were complete, I went on to carbide scraping. Now, I carbide scraped most of the finish off this piece. You could go in with a denatured alcohol to try and remove the shellac, but I do find that sometimes to be a bit messy and it can actually reactivate the shellac and make it even harder to get off. So carbide scraping is a quick and easy way. This is a tungsten carbide blade that you can pick up at Bunnings in Australia, and it will just scrape the existing finish off without having to use a chemical-based stripper. Once the majority of that existing finish was scraped off, I moved on to sanding. Now, I started with 120 grit sandpaper and then moved up the grades. So it's always best to move up the grades, even though you don't tend to get those squiggly pigtail marks with 120 grit sandpaper. It's still a good idea to come up the grades slowly so you are smoothing down any minor scratches or any squiggles that you may have gotten. So I went from the 120 up to 150, then 180, and I finished off with 240 grit sandpaper. The doors of this piece did have an oak veneer. However, on a piece that's this old, the veneer is normally very thick, which it was. So starting off with that 120 grit is a better starting point when you are going over a veneer, but I wasn't really worried about punching through. I did find that this little decal was a little bit loose. It was a little bit wobbly at the front, so I just removed the nails that were holding it in place and opted to glue it back down instead of nailing it into place. By this stage, I had removed all of the handles, so I popped them in some plain white vinegar to soak before moving on to removing the felt that was in this cutlery drawer. This is a two-step process, but first up, I use Crud Cutter. I spray everything down and I leave it to sit before actually filling the drawer with water and letting it soak. While that was doing its magic, I went around with 320 grit sandpaper across the entire piece, and I went around with a wire brush to deepen the grain. So you can see here I am working with the grain with that wire brush, and this just helps to deepen those little lines that you see in the oak, and it will remove any of the existing finish that you weren't able to get off with sanding. It only took around 20 minutes for the glue in this drawer to soften, and I just removed it with my carbide scraper. However, it is so soft that you could peel it off with your hands or use something like a paint scraper to get it out. I did go back over in the drawer with some Crud Cutter just to make sure that none of the glue residue was still sitting in there. To remove the gunk off the handles, I used the brass brush on my drill, and this is one of those working smarter, not harder moments. It just helps to polish them up, especially when you have brass on brass. It will just help to get them shiny so they aren't throwing that coppery tone that brass can do after you've soaked them in vinegar. For this piece, I wanted a durable, natural finish. However, I didn't want it to be too warm and in your face. I wanted a cooler brown tone, but I didn't necessarily want it to be a neutral base. In order to achieve this, I went in with Fiddes Tinted Hardwax Oil and I made my own custom color. I used their dark oak and I used a white to create this cocoa brown tone that would essentially go into the grain and into the details of the piece, just to add a little bit of depth and dimension. Fiddes Hardwax Oil is incredibly durable. It's water resistant, stain resistant, and toy safe, but it's a fantastic option for a piece of furniture like this because it doesn't peel or flake and it's so easy to apply. You can see here that I'm using an old t-shirt, but you could go in with a brush or a roller if you prefer. Once I'd finished applying to the top, I moved in sections, working from the top to the bottom, just making sure that I was applying a nice light coat to the entire surface. I waited 6 hours before applying my second coat, and I just made sure that once I'd actually applied each coat, I turned my fan on to get an ample amount of airflow around the piece. You don't necessarily want it on when you're applying, but while it's drying, it's good to get that airflow. Prior to reinstalling the handles, I did go over them with some European Gold Rub and Buff just to give them more of an aged brass look as opposed to that super shiny brass look. I just think it went a little bit better with the piece. The Fiddes Hardwax Oil did a beautiful job of creating shadow and depth in these carved sections, and I wanted to intensify it that little bit more, so I went around and applied some black wax. And if you want to see this process, the black waxing in a little bit more detail, I did a video. It's in my beginner's tips playlist that goes through step by step what to do and how to apply. Essentially, though, you are applying a soft wax first and then a hard wax second. Then you take the excess off and it creates this beautiful depth and really makes details like this pop. You can see side by side, it's just intensified it that little bit more. And guys, this is the end result. And if you've been following me for a while, you know I don't normally do a warm timber finish. However, I can't see this piece being any other color than what it is right now. I think the grain is stunning. The details alone on this piece are absolutely phenomenal. And if you're an antique furniture lover, I would love to hear from you about what you think about this restoration, but also what time period you think this is from, because I have never seen a piece with this shape and this amount of detail, and I would love to get a little bit more information about it. So let me know in the comments.